Welcome again. Today we're continuing our exploration of the book of Genesis. Previously we've looked at God as creator, and then in the Garden of Eden our creation narrative has adopted a more human scale perspective. These first 11 chapters of Genesis hang together as a unit, and they all seem to fit the creation narrative genre, although the insertion of some genealogies seem to bring in and cross over a different form. They, along with that Toledot formula, these are the generations of phrase we'll see again, they introduce a kind of specificity, a familial lineage sort of perspective. Now, turning to chapter 4, after Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, that sanctuary of God's rest, we're wondering, well, what will life be like in a world of good now tainted by evil? The first events outside of the garden of Genesis 4 answer the question very clearly. Adam and Eve have children, and so we meet both Cain and Abel. Abel keeps flocks while Cain grows crops, and we pick up the narrative in Genesis 4 verse 3. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favour on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favour. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. We're not told here exactly why Abel's offering of the first and finest of his flock draws God's favour, or why Cain's offering from his crops is not looked upon so favourably. We could guess, and we could say, well, Abel gave of his best, the firstborn, the fatty portions, while Cain just gave some fruit, maybe even old fruit. More importantly though, Hebrews 11 tells us that Abel's offering was an expression of his faith, which is a significant difference. Abel is characterized by faith and Cain is not. In response to God's approval of Abel, Cain gets angry. Verse 6, then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Interestingly, God does not leave Cain to simmer in his anger. Abel is experiencing temptation, but God comes to him graciously with kind words of wisdom. And what we see here is that the experience of temptation outside the Garden of Eden is described first of all as an internal battle where Cain must address his own fallen nature in order to live God's way. There's no snake opposing him, seeking his undoing. No, Cain must address himself. Sin desires to rule him, but he must rule over it. So we see here that sin is an opportunistic foe. It waits, crouching, coiled for action at a moment's notice. But God unmasks sin for Cain's benefit. He must know his enemy and know sin plots his demise. Sin is exposed here, and sin exposed, it's halfway to being defeated, right? But only half. Verse 8, now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Sadly, Cain refuses God's warning. Instead, he invites Abel to come for a walk. It sounds innocent enough, but it's not. Cain's own sinful nature pounced upon him, unbridled and indulged. And so then Cain pounced upon Abel. And in his fallen state, Cain is told what he should do with sin. He must rule over it. I don't suppose God would ask him to do the impossible. And so in our state, fallen but with the Holy Spirit, we must also rule over our sin. As Christians, enabled by God's Spirit, we talk back to our urge to sin. We address our pride, our greed, and our lust. We say no. Instead, we look for the alternate path, the way out, God's provision of grace. The Apostle Paul gives us this encouragement with a promise at the end of it. So, if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you do not fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Temptation, when allowed to take hold, stirs up the dark urges that are now implanted within the human heart, and sin follows. On the other hand, temptation, when confronted and opposed, soon slinks away. To be sure, sin and temptation operate much more like deeply embedded addictions, and so it's not always simple. And yet we are assured that God provides a way out so that we can endure temptation. Well, Cain did not endure his temptation. He killed his brother. Verse 9, Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is your brother Abel? I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? The Lord said, What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. In his furtive attempts to hide his sin from God, Cain asks, Am I my brother's keeper? In other words, he claims he has no responsibility for his brother. He doesn't need to look out for him, to care for him, or even to care about him. He's old enough to look after himself. Cain claims he does not need to protect his brother from whatever might befall him. But God's rebuke follows in verse 10. What have you done? Of course, God already knows the answer to his question. Instead of caring for his brother, Cain has killed him. And so, by implication, the answer to the question is yes, we are our brothers and our sisters' keepers. We all have a duty of care and responsibility to protect them, especially the weakest and the most vulnerable. So Genesis 4 presents a very bleak picture of life outside the Garden of Eden. What are human beings like now that they have chosen to embrace evil by rejecting God's way? Well, they're beset by temptation that's often experienced as an inward battle. Temptation comes with subtlety, not necessarily through a talking snake. But the evil one speaks lies that now resonate within the human heart. That's where the battlefield is located. So what can we take away from this? First, we must rule sin and not let sin rule over us. You can check out Romans 6 for more. Secondly, we have an obligation to love one another. We are our brother's keeper. To fail in this is a sin of omission. Love calls us to protect the vulnerable and the weak. So for our thoughts today, what temptations are you wrestling? If you can name them, you're more than halfway to beating them. What are your options for a way of escape from these temptations? How will you respond?